Hello. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming today. My name is Richard Dilworth. I'm the director of Drexel Center for Public Policy. We're hosting this conference on cooperatives. And I just wanted to provide a quick introduction and move on to the incredibly packed agenda that we have with a few logistical details before we begin. So the vast majority of this conference today is occurring in the Geary auditoriums, in which you're in one. I think this is Geary B. Geary A is right next door. The only other time when you have to leave either Geary A, Geary B, or the lobby area is we have two blocks of panels prior to lunch. The first is two panels, one in this room, one in Geary A, and they're relatively longer. And then we have shorter panels after that, after a quick break. We have three panels. The second session of panels prior to lunch are the relatively short sort of the sort of round-tabley ones. And for that, because we have three going on concurrently, we're going to a separate room, and that is room 3304. It's in your program, just letting you know. Kalia Hyacin, who's over here, who's standing up, she will be leading people to that room. If you have any questions, you can ask myself or you can ask Charlotte Jackson in the corner of the room. By the way, Charlotte did most of the heavy lifting for this conference, so thank you, Charlotte. And just one final thing. Given what we wanted to do today, and given that we had a day to do it, we packed it all in as much as we possibly could. So the one result is that we have a limited time for lunch. We've reserved 30 minutes for lunch. That's unfortunate, but at the same time, we just want to give warning so that we don't have any riot actions out in the reception area. Just know that you can come back here with food and eat, and we'll just try to make that as orderly as possible. Obviously, we want to give a lot of people time to talk informally. Hopefully, you can do that throughout the day, and also in those precious 30 minutes for lunch. So that's all I wanted to say logistically for right now. The first thing that we have is Gar Alperovitz, and he's going to be introduced by Bob Noble from the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance. I'm just going to say quickly four things to welcome those of you not from Philadelphia, to welcome you to Philadelphia, and to welcome you to Drexel University. Somebody asked me why we're doing this at the medical school. We're doing this in the medical school because they have bigger auditoriums and they have available auditoriums. And it's in Center City. That was another thing we figured would be relatively convenient. The Center for Public Policy at Drexel University is hosting this. We at the Center for Public Policy think that this was a good thing to support and a good thing to host, primarily for four reasons. First, there's the sort of cooperative component to this day-long conference, but it's also an academic component, and that's sort of where the Center for Public Policy comes in. We're interested in case-based research and case-based research on organizational strategies for economic development. And we saw cooperatives as and the opportunity to work with the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance, with the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives, and all of the other cooperating cooperatives in this event to be right on that goal. And so we organized this around case studies of individual cooperatives, matching those in Pennsylvania, mostly Philadelphia, to Wisconsin, mostly Madison. That's the third thing that I think was important to us from the Center for Public Policy's perspective, was encouraging a dialogue between cities and between two very different cities. Other events and research projects that we've done, we think have been very productive if they put people from different cities on the same topic in rooms together so that they can really genuinely talk to one another. in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise, and hopefully learn something new from one another. And of course, also under our relatively new president at this point, John Fry, we see this as central to the university's new concerted focus on civic engagement, and the President Fry's challenge that Drexel be the most civically engaged university in the country. And that's all I'm going to say, and I'm going to give it over to Bob Noble from the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance, and he's going to introduce Galo Perovitz. Thanks a lot.
Hi, thank you and welcome. Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for Drexel for hosting this conference and the Center for Public Policy. I'm Bob Noble. I work with the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance with Resources for Human Development and the Keystone Development Center. And I'm on the board of Weaver's Way Food Co-op here in Philadelphia. So welcome to the conference. I want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors and contributors. So in addition to Drexel Center for Public Policy and PACA, we have the City of Philadelphia Department of Commerce, the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives, Haverford College's Center for Peace and Global Citizenship, Weaver's Way Co-op, Keystone Development Center, Home Care Associates, Mariposa Co-op, Resources for Human Development, Pennsylvania Credit Union Association, the Energy Co-op, Drexel University's Lindy Center for Civic Engagement, the Urban Affairs Coalition, and the City of Philadelphia Mayor's Office of Sustainability. So we really thank them for contributing and making this. I want to say a word about PACA because we are brand new. In January of last year, a group of cooperative activists, sort of Margaret Mitchellians, if you will, from food and worker co-ops, met in Philadelphia for the purpose of planning what we called a local co-op summit. We were soon joined by representatives from housing co-ops and credit unions. We weren't sure about the exact nature of this summit. All we knew is that we wanted to bring folks from as many different co-ops together as we could. And I want to thank Jim Flaherty from the Department of Commerce, who actually had the idea of planning for a conference like this. He had attended a conference that Drexel put on for business improvement districts a year or two prior to that. And they had done case studies on 16 bids in Philadelphia, and it was a big success. Everything was published, and so he was suggested we try to do the same thing for co-ops. So we talked to, he introduced Richard to the Philadelphia, what is now the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance, and you know, I guess Center for Public Policy didn't know too much about co-ops at the time, and we didn't know too much about academic conferences. But we pulled in some people who did, like Ann Reynolds and Jessica Gordon-Emhard, and sort of managed to figure it out. So I don't know, Jim, I don't see Jim here yet. He'll be here. But I want to thank Jim for the idea, and today is the result of that planning. I'm happy to report that in the course of planning for the conference, this engendered the birth of the Philadelphia Cooperative Alliance. It was last November that we officially named ourselves, and since then we've done several activities. On January 26th, we were successful where the new city council here in Philadelphia passed a resolution recognizing the contributions of co-ops to the city. On February 8th, we kicked off the International Year of Co-ops locally at Fergie's Pub. We had over 70 folks from credit unions and all different kinds of co-ops there. It was a great event. On February 14th, we, with the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Association, sponsored a forum on co-ops. On April 11th, we presented co-ops as a tool for economic development to the Urban Affairs Coalition, and today we have this conference. Meanwhile, we were doing all these activities. We were trying to do organizational development within PACA itself. We asked co-ops around the city, what kind of organization should we be that would provide value to you? We've done a lot of outreach in that respect. In February, Peter Frank, who's one of our founders, led us in a visioning exercise that resulted in focus on 4 priorities around co-op development, education, public policy, and support. In March, we decided that we want PACA to have members, a board, and paid staff, something we still aspire to. We formulated our mission statement to improve the Philadelphia region by growing the cooperative economy. And we are now working on our startup plan and budget and 2 future projects that will kick off after this conference. One is a regional economic impact study for cooperative economy in the area, and the other is a cooperative loan fund. One reason for our early success, I think, that sort of contributed was the declaration by the United Nations that 2012 would be the International Year of Co-ops. So how wonderful could that be? Good timing. The designation of the International Years by the United Nations General Assembly aims to bring worldwide recognition to major issues and to encourage international action to address concerns which have global importance and ramifications. The cooperative community is proud of this designation and excited to use this opportunity to help shine light on the cooperative business model and the role it plays in improving the lives of people everywhere. As the UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon said last October, cooperative enterprises build a better world, and that's the theme of the year. If anyone here wants to learn more about co-ops or needs technical assistance in starting a co-op or knows somebody with it done, please contact PACA. Our website is philadelphia.coop, or you can send email to info@philadelphia.coop. But finally, I want to just mention that PACA is not unique. This idea of regional cross-sector co-op collaboration is actually something that's happened among ag co-ops and rural electric co-ops and the credit unions, more established co-ops on a statewide basis. That's been going on for years. But for the newer co-ops, the food co-ops, a lot of worker co-ops, and then uniting with housing co-ops, credit unions, et cetera, on a regional basis, happening in Philadelphia over the last 3 or 4 years. Madison, Boston, Seattle, Boston, New York, Western New England. It's really a new phenomenon, and I don't know what to make of it yet, but it's a wonderful thing. But here to help us make something of it, along with a lot of the other examples from the new economy, is Gar Aparovitz. People are seeking alternatives, and I don't know of anyone better who can help us find them. I first heard Gar speak in 2005 in Albuquerque at the annual conference of the Food Co-op, CCMA, and he inspired me, to continue the work I was doing and made me see how co-ops were important in a new light. In 2006, we invited him to speak to the Weaver's Way General Membership Meeting, and he was so successful there, he challenged us, and so many people responded that we had 3 study groups going simultaneously reading his book. So Gar Aparovitz has had a distinguished career as a historian, political economist, and activist, writer, and government official. He's currently the Lionel R. Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland, and is a former fellow of King's College, Cambridge University, Harvard's Institute for Politics, the Institute for Policy Studies, and a guest scholar at the Brookings Institute. Among his many achievements is having been in 1977 the architect of the first modern steel industry attempt at worker ownership in Youngstown, Ohio. He is also the president of the National Center for Economic and Security Alternatives and is founding principal of the University of Maryland-based Democracy Collaborative, a research institution developing practical policy-focused and systemic paths towards ecologically sustainable, community-oriented change and the democratization of wealth. If you've not yet done so, you should visit their website. It's fantastic. It's communitywealth.org, community-wealth.org. So I now give you Gar Alperovitz.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for having me. I'm particularly pleased to be here for a personal reason. I'm a Badger, too. I'm from Wisconsin, and it's great to see all you Wisconsinites there. Racine, Wisconsin, so in the southern part of the state, but I went to the University of Wisconsin, too, so a great place for co-ops and the kind of things, and also for concern about serious change in a broader sense. I've been pondering your title of the conference and wondering, cooperatives and economic democracy and community development. And I've been wondering how seriously we take putting those two together, particularly the latter piece, what it will really take to rebuild America's communities. So I want to raise a few questions with you, coming from my own work, coming from the discussions I've had around the country, coming from some of the projects we've been involved with in places like Cleveland. But at the outset, you've invited a political economist and a historian to talk to you, so let me give you a little sense of some of the things I've been thinking about that may or may not, I hope, relate to what you're thinking about. The first is, this conference was sold out early. Why did that happen? Secondly, I was just at Bard College for a conference sponsored by a new organization that has no staff, virtually no money, and is just beginning, called the New Economics Institute. I'm on the board of it, so I know how limited we are. Sold out, 500 people, 2 months in advance. There are meetings on worker ownership going on around the country, sold out. There are people talking about public banking. There are people talking about ESOPs in new ways also. There are people talking about various forms of state investment strategies, and conferences are exploding in different parts of the country. Why is that happening? I've been doing this for a fair bit of time. Bob's been doing it for longer. Why are people coming around? Now, it's obvious, and why particularly, so this is a little nasty part, why are they coming to you folks? Co-ops are right at the center of concern in many parts of the country. Not just to do co-ops, that's important, but looking for a new way forward in general that keeps coming back to something like the co-op idea. Looking for some handhold on a new future and not quite sure what to do with it. Tends to put a responsibility on you folks, by the way, and all of us. Big time, much bigger. I take you all very seriously, maybe more seriously than some of you do, because people are coming around. Well, one of the reasons, in my view and my experience, that this is happening, and I think it's critical, and I say it as a historian, as a political economist, the massive political economic crisis the nation is facing, for the first time in my life, I think is opening people to the question of whether or not we're facing a systemic crisis, not a political crisis. Meaning people have sensed something, some vague, some hard, something fundamental is wrong. Maybe we'll elect a new guy, maybe we'll elect Obama, but will the basic economic trends change? Will the cities get any better? Will the distribution of income stop going south? Will the wealth trends change? Will climate change change? Can the system ever get unstuck in Washington? Now, these are obvious, but what's new, I think, is people are beginning to reflect on where it might go and what do we do about it and how do we deal with building out a new future. So I think that's the first way to think about and what brings people kind of looking around, what's happening over there with the co-ops. They have something to tell us or not? I mean, I'm not sure what's that about. And they are. They keep asking about it. The second way to look at it is this. I've been involved, Bob mentioned I was involved with the steelworkers in 1977, and I'm beginning to see very interesting trends. 1977, a long time ago, Youngstown, Ohio, the first Youngstown sheet and tube. 5,000 people lost their jobs in one day in September 1977. That was the first time in the United States in the post-war period a dramatic closing of 5,000 people at one shot. Hit the newspapers all over the country, all the television programs, national news, 5,000 people lost their jobs. That's common now. Then it was a big deal. The local steelworkers got upset, and they said, you know, our lives are at stake. The religious leaders in that town got upset, and they said, you know, let's try, young steelworker put the idea forth first, why can't we set this up as a worker-owned company or a worker community-owned company? Giant steel mill. So they organized the religious coalition and the local labor unions, and they began developing political pressure around the state, even forced the conservative Governor Rhodes of the state to support them. So they were walking on two legs, building an idea and doing the politics. And they got the Carter administration to finance a very sophisticated study of how to do the mill. $200,000 in those days was a lot of money. And the best, I was the architect of the study, kind of overseeing it. We got the best steel consultants, developed a new model, the kind of technology that's now being used, had a sophisticated business plan, and it was a model that would certainly work. Then they did further political work. They got the Carter administration to pledge $200 million in loan guarantees to support the model. And they were on their way, they thought. They were also quite hip. They knew that sometimes things don't work out when you're trying to do something bold. So they decided, no matter what happens, we're going to also have a second strategy, which is to educate this state and this country about a new idea, a cooperative vision, a worker-owned company in that case. So they built a whole educational program throughout the country and through the nation. National religious groups stepped up to the plate as well, television, video, et cetera, and they did that side of it. They did not get their $200 million. After the election of 1978, the Carter administration somehow faded into the woods about that $200 million. We found out that the big steel companies, not surprisingly, and the International Union had cut down that money. The International Union, by the way, didn't like those local activist young steelworkers who were very clever and intelligent and might make a challenge, and, you know, they didn't like this idea too well, and they didn't like worker ownership either at those days. Different era. But what's happened, so they didn't get their mill. And the point of this story begins here. What's happened out of that struggle, remember I'm a historian, step by step, in the state of Ohio, they began to educate. Somebody was inspired. John Logue set up a little place at Kent State to help set up worker-owned companies. Step by step, there are probably now more worker-owned companies in the state of Ohio per capita than any place in the country, more or less, out of their effort. They were both trying to build, and we use the word activist. They were activists trying to change something. I think the better word is citizen. They were actually taking responsibility for something beyond what they were doing, these steelworkers and these religious leaders. So step by step, the next step in that process, some of you may have heard of the Cleveland Evergreen Cooperatives. We're going to have a big panel on that here, and our group was involved in helping set that up. For those of you who don't know, that's a series of integrated worker co-ops One is a large-scale laundry. One is a solar installation. It's the greenest laundry in that part of the country, uses about a third of the water and a third of the heat that most laundries do. There is an solar installation and weatherization company. Over the next year or two, it will put in more capacity in the state of Ohio than now exists. There is another company which will open up this summer, which is about a 3.25 acre hydroponic greenhouse capable of producing something of the order of 3 million heads of lettuce a year, et cetera, and they're online to put in two new co-ops a year, they think, maybe 3, building out for the future. What's interesting about it, and makes it a next step in this evolution from Youngstown, is it is supported in significant part by the purchasing power of the anchor institutions in that area. That is to say, Cleveland Clinic, the University Hospital, Case Western Reserve, they buy $3 billion a year in goods and services, none of which went to this area. It's an area where the average income is $18,000 a year, unemployment 40%, mostly black. And the notion was, can we start directing some of that purchasing power to help stabilize the community and the co-ops? So that's the model, except for one addition. They are linked together by a nonprofit corporation. They're not simply worker co-ops. They can't be sold off without permission from the community corporation, and they feed money back, a percentage of their profits, in order to start new co-ops. The idea is to build the entire community, not just the worker co-ops, and use the purchasing power, you may have thought about it, obviously, of institutions like hospitals and universities, which are significantly publicly funded. Medicare and Medicaid, educational money. So there's a larger design at work here, and it's all green as well by design. The model is a broader conception. It is a worker co-op model, but it attempts to design something that has a certain broader idea of what we're trying to do here, and use power and expand and extend out from the principle of cooperatives to a principle of community and cooperatives, and to a design, think about this, and to a design which gives a certain stability rather than is only reliant on the market. So just to think about it, when we start producing those mass transit vehicles and high-speed rails, which one day we will, it'll be all public money nationally, and it'll be all commuter money. So someday think about those steel mills and those purchasing power and stabilizing big industrials like worker-owned companies to do that. There's a model in here that's very interesting for the stage beyond. But the reason I tell this story is not only because that's an interesting model. What I find really important about it is the developmental process over time. The expansion of an idea, both in numbers in Ohio, in conception, in sophistication, in design, and in education beyond and to notions of community as a developmental process. I could go on with that and give you more detail about it, but it is particularly instructive, I think, and it ties in with the question of why so many people are interested in what you all do, why the Occupy movement is talking, when they come down to it, they come down largely on what we can do as something like a co-op, and why people are coming in on that. I suspect the big reason is, and I suspect why we're going to see more of it, is people are searching both for a vision that can be made real and practical, but also something that addresses the central question of who gets the political economic power in a system, this system. Now, there's lots of ways to come at that, and it's a big subject, but the simplest way to get at it, I think, and this is the second thing that's happening, why I think so many people are looking at these conferences and coming around and wondering what's going on, and maybe I should do something, and is there anything here for me? The number that makes it clearest for me, the simplest number, we can get very sophisticated and do footnotes if we have time. The simplest number is this. The top 400 people, individuals, not abstract, 400 people now have more wealth in the United States than the bottom 185 million people taken together. And it is getting worse. The trends are not favorable. Now, that's to be looked at as a question of inequity, which it is. But what it really tells you about is the concentration and ownership of wealth in private hands rather than in a democratic form. One other way to look at it is this: if there is ever to be an alternative to that, somehow it involves the democratization of ownership in some way. So now we're moving from just the idea that co-ops are a good thing, what are you guys doing, maybe you can help me, to in the co-op idea, and in many other things, land trusts, we're seeing them around, even some of the ESOPs. I know folks don't like ESOPs. Some of them are democratizing. In the land trust, in the municipal ownership, there is a different way of thinking about who gets to own the central power base of the system, wealth. And I think that's what's at stake in part in the interest, that people realize, and let me put it in larger terms, people realize that power in any system is oriented in significant part around wealth. And if you can't tax and change that wealth pattern and regulate it, either we begin to build slowly in a new direction or the trends continue. I think that's part of what's going on here, a hunger for a new way forward. Now, that's a very hard thing to even contemplate. But the reason I think it's going to go forward more and more and more is as follows. And I'm going to give you a kind of perspective on it that perhaps will be obvious and perhaps not so obvious. One of the things that's happened, I come out of liberalism. You mentioned I worked in the House and the Senate. I worked for Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day. I was his legislative director. We could pass legislation in those days. We passed the Great Society, we passed health, we passed the Air and Water Act. You could do very interesting things. Politics was possible. There has been a steady decline in the capacity of progressives, as is obvious, to alter those trends. That's why the income and wealth trends are going south. That's why the environmental trends are going south. That's why the unemployment doesn't change. The old progressive power base is slowly declined. And it is systemic and institutional, not simply political. Let me say that again. The decline in the institutional base of politics, the decline is institutional in the progressive base of politics. And it has a punchline for all of us. And here's the decline. Labor unions throughout the advanced industrial world are always a key part of the institutional power base of the Progressive Alliance. They made it possible, and the studies on this in political economy are universally, they're all the same. They make it possible to put together the other pieces of the alliance in order to do the taxing, in order to do the regulating, in order to do the reallocation of resources, in order to pass the legislation. And if you haven't got labor, you lose power steadily over time. In all of the advanced countries, even more so here. Labor movement has gone from 34.5% in 1950 at its peak membership, never like Sweden, which was 85%. It's gone down now to 11.8% overall, just under 7% in the private sector, and declining. And when people like Mr. Walker in Wisconsin get serious with the Koch brothers behind them, and they eliminate some of the features of the normal public employee contract so that the dues collection disappears, they go down 2/3 in 1 year in the state of Wisconsin in terms of membership. That's a heavy rap. The base of the progressive movement that used to do the kind of politics that we all kind of still hope will happen again and have to fight for is declining. The institutional muscle. So here's where it gets interesting. If you think as a citizen, like those guys in Ohio, about where all this might go over a couple decades. If you think like citizens in this room, as well as cooperators, the question is there a way to rebuild a new institutional base that might contribute to solidifying a new progressive alliance over time that might be able to allocate some of the funding we're going to need to do real community development rather than poke around the edges as it goes down to 10, 20, and 15 and 20% unemployment? We're going to have to build a new politics to make the things we want to happen become more than tokens. And that requires building institutions. And I think what's happening is people's sense about the co-ops and about the worker-owned companies, about the public banking, and about the many other things that are going on around the country, that somehow in that notion of democratizing ownership from the ground up, building a new base from the ground up, building alliances but also institutions, there may be, and particularly if we touch on the question of who owns the wealth, by demonstrating a different way, there may be the beginnings of a new vision that inspires. That's why they're looking at you. Something inspirational about what you're doing that inspires, but also gets very sophisticated about building the power base out institution by institution and changing the politics. So that, for instance, in the city of Cleveland, all of a sudden the mayor begins to have an alternative place to build jobs rather than having to bribe the corporations to come in for a while until they leave and then others come in. It's about $200,000 a job now, the studies say. Beginning to build up alternatives that have real muscle over time and political punch, and beginning to do that in a sophisticated way. I've been traveling around the country a lot lately talking about these various developments, all the things that are encompassed in the idea of a new economy, and there is enormous interest in other parts of this as well. Just about 3 weeks ago, here in Philadelphia, big issue of public banking. That is like the state of, and again, another form of changing the ownership. Some of you know about the North Dakota Bank, which is a publicly owned bank by the state. It's the only one in the country. Many other countries have public banks. There are 20 states now introduced legislation to set up public banks. Many cities are moving their money to support credit unions and maybe a couple public banks locally. To finance what? To finance the kind of development that has a cooperative or worker ownership capacity in it. There are many, many cities beginning to do that. There are other parts of the puzzle emerging in other areas. The healthcare industry, for instance, is going to beat us badly no matter what the Supreme Court does for a while. And then we're going to see a lot of pain on the streets, I think, for a while. But lo and behold, there are almost 20 states that are now introducing single payer. And I think as that pain level increases, and as the cost structures increase, another way of changing public and some change of ownership for a different democratization possibility is likely to emerge there. I suspect this is where we're going. And I could go on in several areas, but what it seems to be happening, I would suggest to you, that as the pain levels increase, Ohio had 30 years. They've been having the depression we now all begin to face nationally for a long time, and that's what's been driving a lot of what's happened there. If we are going into that prospect, and I think we are going to find more and more people hungry for alternatives that both build a different change in ownership, begin to provide jobs, begin to provide services, and begin to open out a perspective that deals with that central problem that we don't like to look at. Who owns the wealth in the system, and is there another way? Maybe. The options before us are that what we do is very nice, useful work, and none of the trends change. It's an option. The option is the right wing takes over and the trends keep going. It's an option. Rome decayed. Another option is there'll be violence. And with violence, I'm talking about where we're going over the next decade or two. By the way, that is the question. Not just what we're doing, but the chips that you play this game with are decades of your life. What is it we're trying really to do beyond this project? It's possible that there'll be repression, violence, and then there'll be repression. It's also possible, and I'm not a utopian, I've been in real politics in Washington, heavy duty, nasty politics. It is also possible, think of the progressive era, think of the New Deal, think of the women's movement, think of the civil rights movement, think of the Arab awakening, think of the American Revolution. It is also possible that steadily over time, people like us, who else? Who else may lay down step by step the foundations, the institutional patterns, the ideas, the experience, the politics, the vision to slowly constitute the next system, whatever that might look like, that alters some of the structural foundations over time. I'm a realist, but I'm also from Wisconsin. A lot of the New Deal programs were hatched in not only in the state and local laboratories in the 2 decades before the New Deal, and a lot of them were in Wisconsin, so we kind of, pat ourselves on the back for what they did, those people who invested decades building up to the point where then the right moment came and something changed nationally. So if you think I'm suggesting to you why this conference is very important, more important, as I said, perhaps from my perspective than maybe some of you might have thought, I see this kind of work as absolutely central to establishing foundation bases both for what you can do with a co-op, how we get that model refined, how we expand it, how we change it, how we elaborate it, what we learn for the next step, all the problems and all the difficulties, but also what vision it gives other people around the country, what ideas it gives, but also, if we do our work well, how we stretch, hard word, stretch, to imagine what we're doing also in a larger frame, to see it both as a co-op, but how do we take this to the next step? And how might we actually think about, over time, the nitty-gritty of putting together legislation so that we've got a legislative program that takes us beyond just the isolated co-ops, and maybe a national politics and a strategy. Really interesting what Bob was saying. 7, 8 years ago, there were co-ops, and now there's a coalition of co-ops. And hopefully a strong coalition, building power as you go. That's the stepping stone up and down. And the idea system. Ideal and ideas. I'm a writer. I'm a historian. I write books, write articles. I don't think ideas matter most of the time. But sometimes they do. They matter when people know something is wrong with the ideas they are being hit with day by day by day, and they know it isn't make sense anymore. That's when people begin asking deeper questions. And at those times, ideas are powerful. You guys represent an idea system. That means you've got a lot of responsibility. That it doesn't continually narrow down, but that it expands outward and opens up larger vistas and addresses bigger concerns too, in a time not only when pain and decay are forcing people to ask questions, but when the idea system about where the hell is this going begins to make people ask new questions. I sometimes put it this way: if you don't like corporate capitalism and you don't like state socialism, what do you want? And if you don't know, what are you talking about? There's another stretch for us. How do we begin to open ourselves to the notion that here's the good part, we crazy, inventive, decentralized Americans. Great tradition, decentralization, community by community, initiative, self-help, all the kind of stuff you find here and you don't find in countries like France. Our kind of down-home, old tradition, it really is one of the positive features of this country people neglect. I mean, like what you all do. Hey, you roll up your sleeves, you need to do it. You get some people together and start building and start getting on with it. That tradition, once awakened, has its own power, and it projects a vision, maybe, at least a trajectory, or at least a possibility, or a new direction that is highly decentralized, yet changes who owns the wealth in a different way, yet builds community in a new way, yet begins to develop the possibilities of a sketch of a direction beyond. Now, that's a heavy, heavy idea. Are you talking to me about changing the structure of the system in some sense? Really? United States of America? The next 30 years? Come on, I'm saying, yes, that we must open ourselves to that possibility. We'll see about whether we get there. But movement in that direction, because we all know that there's a big problem. You can't do economic development when there's 20% unemployment. You can just poke around the edges. So we need a trajectory and a vision that moves us further and farther in a new way. Now let me blue sky with you a little bit. Then I'll come back to a couple other points and then I'll sit down. I mentioned what's going on. It isn't what's happening in the lots of other areas, in the public banking, in the community development, in the solidarity economy, all kinds of things, in the co-op, in the worker ownership, in the change in ESOPs, the beginning. In Ohio, the studies show that as you get more people in ESOPs, there are 10 million people in those ESOPs. As you get more and more shares of ownership, the participation levels go up, and then some of them become unionized. And by the way, those steelworkers unions nationally who were against all this back in 1977, over time, steelworkers are now pushing worker ownership as a formal position. And some of they changed too. Another change in the process out of this pain and out of the dead end. Notice that dead end. You can't get there the old way, so we're going to have steelworkers are now pushing union ownership, worker ownership. So there's another part of the economy that is also many other parts that are going through similar transitions, and they give us a sense of alliances that will be built and are being built. I mentioned the healthcare sector. That system over the next 20 years is all but certain to decay into something like a single payer, I suggest to you. Why? The cost problems are not solvable this way. The big corporations who are exporting need to get those costs off their back. The people are going to see, you are going to see, we are going to see people thrown out in the street who are sick and dying in the street, as it happened before the last healthcare debate. The cost pressures, bankruptcy rates are going to go up, and there is going to be political pressure to change this thing over time, and the only solution available over the next period is piece by piece, state by state, bit by bit, agonizing fights towards something like single payer. I'm not a utopian. That logic is powerful, internal to the cost structure problem. I just said 20% of the U.S. economy may be displaced. You set up a single-payer healthcare system, you're displacing an insurance company. You begin to provide jobs and give the mayor an option, you're displacing that corporation. There is a process underway elsewhere that works in the same direction. When those big banks went down, threw thousands, millions of people out of work, bankrupt other people, and they did go down, there was anger, deep anger. The Obama administration didn't follow through. He said to the bankers, literally, I'm the only thing stands between you and the pitchforks. But then he went and supported them rather than trying a new solution, as the Roosevelt administration did. Every expert I know, left, right, and center, understands that you can't regulate these guys, that they are lobbyists undermining it, and therefore there will be another financial crisis. There's no question in the minds of most financial experts. And then the anger will bubble up again. as people lose their houses. And you saw the costs. People lost massive parts of their retirement as well as their houses. And the anger built up, even the Tea Party. The solution people are now talking about, and it's certainly the next step in this fight, so I'm giving you some suggestions just to think about maybes. These are maybes. I think they're likelies. When they do it again, they will break up the big banks. That's what, break them up. And of course, then they'll regroup. The big fish will eat the little fish, and we'll be back where we are. And at some point, I think the chief economist of Citicorp, conservative banker, was right. At some point, if the public keeps paying the bill, they will be taken over and made into public utilities. I think that's going to happen. Maybe. I think you're going to see, and by the way, did you notice we also nationalized 2 big auto companies and then gave them away when the profits flowed in a different way? I think down the trajectory we're going, because of the logic that is causing pain and no alternatives, there are going to be some very interesting fights down the line that are, in a sense, alliances of people who find only a democratization strategy, healthcare, banks, worker-owned companies, co-ops, as the only alternative and begin to build in that direction. Maybe. In any case, whether that happens or not and how far it goes, it all comes back, from my point of view, to whether or not we know what we're talking about day to day in actual real models on the ground. And that's where you guys come in. There aren't any people you have more people in this room right now who actually know about this, either by experience or research or by both, who can help inform this kind of a direction, however far it goes, perhaps in any place in the country. So the work is important both in its own right, critical, but also in terms of its possibility of informing a direction. Whether it's a little direction, big direction, we don't know. Might even transform. We may actually be in the prehistory of the next great systemic change. But in any case, a direction that moves and democratizes those wealth patterns that are behind the political power patterns and begins to suggest a different way, even as the old liberal progressive movement fades and decays. Hey, I'll take whatever we can get and keep going that direction. We have to fight that fight, but we can see the trend in that fight. So there's more to do on our side. You all suggest a direction beyond. So let me say a couple more things about some of the exciting things that's happened as I go around the country listening to people. People may be surprised. Last night I was at the dinner, and I think some of you kind of were surprised when I asked this question. I've asked about 6 or 7 different people. What should I talk about tomorrow? You invite a speaker to come, and he says, what do you want me to talk about? But I actually meant it in the sense, I come to these conferences to learn. I don't come to talk. I mean, that's just my excuse. And I learned a lot last night, by the way. Thank you, guys, about what people are really thinking about. What I mean is I want to hear where is the conversation emerging and where is it developing and how's it going? And so that's a couple of things I've learned here and a couple of things I've learned elsewhere around the country, just to give you an idea of how this thing is building. You keep hearing new things as people look for new ways to take this democratization, cooperative vision principle forward. So here's the one I like best, and then I'll tell you the next one, and then I'll sit down. As I said, I spoke at a worker ownership conference in Vermont. Was it last Wednesday, I think? And then I had to get over to this other conference at Bard College in upstate. You can't get to Bard. It's in the woods. Some people know. You're somewhere up there. I have no idea how they got there. But you got to cross Lake Champlain, and you got to drive up. You can get somebody to drive you over if they've got one of these deals that can find its way. He can get you there maybe. So they asked the young guy to drive me over to Bard. It's about a 5-hour drive. And so we had a lot to talk about. And he was a young Occupy guy and very interested in organizational theory. He was very sophisticated about organizational institutional theory. And then he told me what he was really doing. I have to tell you secretly, I've been waiting for somebody to do it. And here's what he said. He said, these credit unions, they're fantastic. 130 million people involved in co-ops and credit unions. 40% of the American society. No small change there, if something could happen. He said, these credit unions, forgive me, there are probably some credit union people here. There's wonderful credit unions, but there's a lot that are just ordinary banks. He said that a lot of these guys, they're just ordinary banks. And we got one really sticky, kind of stodgy one. We've got 5 or 6 of them in Burlington, Vermont, but one of them is really just doesn't do anything the banks don't do. It's cautious, it won't invest in the community, it won't deal with co-op, blah, blah, blah. He said, it dawned on us, these are one person, one vote democratized ownership structures, right? Right. We're joining up. Nobody ever goes to those annual meetings. The guy who runs it's making $450,000 a year, and he makes sure nobody hears about the meetings. And besides, the people aren't interested because it doesn't have anything to do with the community. It's just a bank. And it is a democratic bank. So we're joining up, opening accounts, and we're building membership, and we elected the first guy this year to the board. And next year we're going to elect 2 or 3 more, and we're going to take that thing over and start using it for other purposes. 2, there's a power in that idea. When that begins to dawn on people around the country, that some of the legacy of the old cooperative credit union movement might actually be helping out community development, economic development, and other co-ops in a powerful way, there is power there. And it is the kind of thinking I urge you to say, hey, how do we look in new ways to transforming these relationships and using what we have, the handholds that we have, building step by step in a new direction? So that's one thing I heard. And, I keep hearing these all the time, so that's the most recent one. Another one I've heard from a couple other people, and we've been thinking about it ourselves, is this. And I haven't seen this done, but I'm hearing people talk about it. So maybe, Philadelphia, Madison, elsewhere, who knows? You folks are from all over where this happens. Cleveland happened for specific reasons, and many, many, many cities are picking up on it now. Once it was a demonstration project. There's going to be one in Pittsburgh, there's going to be one in Atlanta, a couple in the Washington, D.C. area, one in Amarillo, Texas. Ideas are important. If you can pull something off in almost any place that's successful, because the crisis is so deep, you will find other people really interested. So here's the other one I keep waiting to happen. Everywhere in the country right now, the cities are in terrible shape. And the teachers are getting it, and the public service employees are getting it, and they're putting the taxpayers against labor. Big time. And you can fight that fight as best you can, even as labor goes down. But the only answer is a serious strategy and a political alliance that says we're going to build and rebuild the tax base of this community through institutions that will stay here. Co-ops, worker-owned companies don't get up and move. And we're going to make that the argument with labor. It's the only answer you have to the taxpayer problem, because otherwise you keep losing the tax base as you bribe the corporations and they leave. And there is a political alliance in rebuilding strong institutions like Cleveland, like the co-ops, powerful, and getting those anchor institutions, places like this, to come in and say, hey, rebuild this base, and putting together the politics that's implicit in the institutional designs that are emerging. I haven't seen anybody do that yet, but I'll bet you on my travels or your travels, in the next year or two, someone will say to me, hey, you know what we're doing? There is a spirit of really trying to get at it and invent and develop and move beyond. You shouldn't trust me when I say I'm only going to say one more thing, because sometimes I don't. I am going to stop now, because I do want to say simply that why it's a privilege to be with you, and why, and particularly the Wisconsin gang out here, is that I suspect folks like people in this room don't quite know your power. What I see when I look at this room is power. I see people who are at the core working out of inspiration and serious moral commitment and sophisticated knowledge at the centerpiece of the ideas of how do you democratize. So I see, yes, food co-ops and worker-owned co-ops and credit unions and so forth, but I see the only place in the United States of America where people are actually working really on these problems in ways that could teach the rest of us a whole lot, both about what we do locally, what we do in the states, but just possibly how we begin to transform and lay the foundations for changing the power and political and moral relationships in the greatest powerful corporate capitalism of the world. Just possibly. So finally, I have to tell you who my heroes are, just so you know, and why I look at you a little differently. My heroes are the civil rights workers in Mississippi who were working in the 1930s and 40s. You know, when they'd hang you from a tree after they tortured you, if you tried to make trouble. Those are the people who laid down the foundation stones that made possible the explosion of the 60s. They established the prehistory without which you cannot build the next movement. So if you think I'm looking at you that way, that is what I'm doing. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions, I guess.
Yeah, we have the next panels are 10 minutes after 10, so I think we can take about 15 minutes for question and answer if anyone wants to line up here to the microphone. Anyone at all?
So you want to know the speaker? My question has to do with the. I'm Gina Snyder. I'm the director of the East Falls Development Corporation. My question has to do with basically capital. Where is the capital going to come from? Because if we're talking, we've been talking, having conversations about food cooperative, and everything always goes back to getting money from the bank to get things started. So where do regular people access capital if that's the foundation for starting things that end up being worker owned or member owned or whatever owned, if they especially if credit unions aren't acting like anything other than a bank?
Well, first, I suspect there are people in this audience who can tell you how they've done it in other places, but I think the obvious place is, the first place is catch as catch can. That's the way all the projects start, right? You find something, you get a foundation to kick in, you get a sponsor, you get a university, maybe you get a little bank, maybe you get an angel. But secondly, what's interesting about the Cleveland model, which is we know a lot about, or at least Steve Dubb is going to be presenting about it later today, our research director, and so he can give you detailed answers. Let me tell you about the Cleveland model, because there you've got promises of some kind of procurement, of some kind. And if they know that, for instance, there's going to be a market, that's a bankable loan. And indeed, in the midst of the worst financial crisis in modern American history, we got bank loans in Cleveland. So that's another place. The unions have pension funds if you get them on your side. The universities have pensions, and they have money that they can invest, and some of the students would be right with you if they wanted to make a little fight for some of it. So I think the pieces of the puzzle, and those credit unions can be challenged. I don't say this is an easy process. People here will tell you how they did it in different ways. I'll bet it's a lot of it's catch and catch can, until you get to a place where you've got bankable loans and bankable businesses. So I don't think there's any secret to it, but I think the sources of capital for longer term are the ones I've mentioned, and they're the ones that are going to take some political or community organizing as well. Or in some cases, we found in Cleveland, some of the anchor institutions, for two different reasons. One, it was good for them to build out that neighborhood with 40% unemployment. To begin to change it was good for them. Cleveland Clinic has the name Cleveland, and it's a terrible neighborhood. And secondly, some of these people care about it as much as you do and want to do something positive and creative and approach it in the right way, and they might help. And thirdly, some of them need to be pushed pretty hard. So I don't have a magic answer, but I suspect other people may be able to do better on the immediate sources. Sir?
We're getting there. Thank you again for your remarks. I'm accustomed to seeing them on video, so I feel like it's a special privilege to be in the room to hear them. And my name is Eric DeLuca. I'm the program manager for the International Year of Cooperatives in the U.S. Through the National Cooperative Business Association. And just wanted to follow up on the thoughts you introduced about the civil rights movement. And one of the things that I heard Bob Moses say, who was a leader that had a really big impact in Mississippi in that second wave and has continued to think about how to support structural lasting change institutionally, is that, again, these cycles are generational, and that things that we want to see really take hold at a national level, we're looking 30 years ahead. And so his recommendation to folks was to talk to the 10-year-olds. And so I'm interested in your view on how we can support young people that are getting engaged with getting things started, cooperative entrepreneurism. I know we've got one program called Cooperative Teachin' that seemed exciting to you, and folks can get involved. Any co-op can work with this young worker co-op. Teachin.coop, teach-in.coop is one way that you can get education, kind of a co-ops 101 for young people on campuses and in communities anywhere around the country, and your local co-op leaders can come in. So that's one example, but I'm just interested in your views on how to spark and encourage young cooperative entrepreneurs who are going to bring about this change over the next 30 years.
No simple magic, but I think it's not only the 10-year-olds. Let me give you two different categories. It is really obvious to any students with these loans now, with no jobs, that they know better than anybody there's a profound crisis. So that's a group that really needs to be spoken to and addressed and brought in to help, because all this abstraction we're talking about here is not abstract. It's people who cannot find a life and no money and big loans. So educating and beginning to draw some of those folks in to help build a future through the pain is another piece of the puzzle. But I don't have an answer to how to reach younger people, but I'll bet there are people in this room who have been experimenting, and I think that's what's so wonderful about it. Sure, there's one over there. See? This is what's exciting. There's somebody over there.
She suggested North American Students of Cooperation, NASCO.coop, so that's a great resource. Also, I'm seeing people from COFED. So cofed.org is another resource for young people across the country to get involved in starting co-ops.
There you go.
Hi, my name's Brianna. I'm from Representative Sherelle Parker's office. We're in the Northwest Philadelphia district. My question for you is I came in when you were discussing about the co-op in where the idea is that you have this nonprofit over the numerous co-ops, and that the co-ops would pay a percentage back to nonprofits to help fund more co-ops and everything like that. I guess my question is twofold. One is, in situations like that, since the idea is the co-op or the workers own the business and everything like that, what happens when a business doesn't do as well as anticipated? And then the second is, how do you explain to people? I remember reading a while back, for example, in China about a town that was in a cooperative experience, because a lot of towns are like that, and one in particular was thriving well beyond all the others, and everyone lived in fabulous homes and everything like that, and it really wasn't a possible way for people, once it reached a certain point, to join in on that co-op. But then in that sense, when you think about it, in China, there are other communities that are incredibly impoverished. And so in a sense, it sounds like a commune type situation, but it in practice, when you have a joint situation like that, how do you make sure that everybody keeps moving and there isn't a situation where one group is just doing incredibly fantastic and another is like, our business failed. Now what do we do?
So I have to say I love you. I really like the questions. Those are the kinds of questions we need to ask. We need to work through some of the theoretical problems that take us beyond, and those are two of them. Mm-hmm. That is, they're large structural, they're implicit in the problem we're talking about, and they push us. They push us to stretch. So I really do. On the first question, I suspect we're going to have bankruptcies and failures, and either these institutions will be strong enough to absorb it the hard way, or some of them are going to go down. This is hard stuff. Period. Yeah. But it is. So that's number one. But let me go to the second one. I have good friends who are simply worker ownership people. Worker ownership is the answer, and I'm a worker ownership person. I think whatever we do, we need worker co-ops and worker ownership. But look, in the larger vision of the society we want to build, we need to stretch to this. The workers who own the garbage co-op and the workers who own the petroleum co-op are going to be really different people. Mm-hmm. That is not an equitable society. Implicit in this other model is something like a community building vision that at least begins to address it. Okay. And a sense of equity built in and beginning to think about that. How we generalize that beyond one neighborhood or one community, that's going to be one of our problems. Otherwise, we're going to end up with just as you're talking about. But I do want to say something about this commune structure. I love that. That was a good term. What we're finding, I had this great experience. I was invited to speak to a Chamber of Commerce meeting, Economic Development Division in a very conservative part of the state of Maryland, wanted me to come talk about this Cleveland model. I don't get invited to the Chamber of Commerce every day. So I put on my most conservative suit and tie. And I went and Steve Dubb came along because he knows much more about this than I do in detail. And we talked to them about what we're doing in Cleveland and what we're helping people do in Cleveland. We're not the only people doing it, the Democracy Collaborative, and we've got lots of partners. Laying out just what I said here, but in more detail. And then, I was waited for them because this is communal socialism, workers' ownership of the means of production. That's what it is. And they said to me, "Why aren't you doing it here instead of in Cleveland? We need that here." To a person. They saw it as helpful for the local economy, smart use of the anchor institution's resources, build more consumers, help the small businessmen, help the tax base. Great stuff. What are you talking about? Why are you over there? Come back here. We've been having not big problems with. So at the local level, rather than the ideological conservatives who are on the television all the time, people want an answer. Practical answer is critical. It's got to make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, you shouldn't do it. So that's that kind of thing. I had the other piece of that story is that same night I happened to be talking to radical organizers in Baltimore. They said the same thing. Why aren't you doing it here? So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but that's how I think about it.
Okay, thank you.
Sir.
We've got about 5 to 7 minutes. I just noticed a whole bunch of people lined up. So I do want to point out, I think let's take time for 2 more questions. Sorry. But obviously, Gary, you're going to be around.
Not the whole day, but I will be around for a while.
So you'll have a chance to come up and ask him as well, any questions you have. But the 2 people who came up last, so we'll go over here and the gentleman over here. We can take those 2 questions.
Thank you, sir. I'm familiar with Norm Curlin, the Center for Economic and Social Justice, and your punchline of working as a citizen is as good as his, which says you will own or be owned.
That's
the
good.
First thing I want to say.
Good.
And I'm from Jasper Jones from WPEV, and I actually had on my radio show a union officer and a person from the occupied Philadelphia, and we were talking about how you convert the utilities to customer and employee owned so we can transition to hydrogen. Have you encountered that any place around the country?
In terms of hydrogen?
Yes, converting to hydrogen, but taking and restructuring utilities that might be city owned so that they actually are employee and customer owned, which actually will solve the problem.
Right. I have not, but here's again, there may be both the hydrogen and that model may be emerging in a place I don't know, because that's what usually happens. Somebody tells me about it. But I do want to mention something about the utilities. As you probably know, again, just in response, I don't have an answer, except if you hear about it, tell me, please, so I can use it in the next talk. You all know that 25% of American electricity is socialized. Did you know that? There are 2,000 public utilities, and there are enough co-ops that you get to 25% under that form of ownership. And maybe we'll get some worker-owned co-ops, worker-owned structures as well. So that's where we are now. So there's a base to build on there, too, when you look around and take a peek.
Hi there. I'm a little nervous, so bear with me. My name's Hannah. I'm from the North American Students of Cooperation, also a member owner of Mariposa, and have my roots in Weaver's Way Co-op. I'm from Philadelphia. My question is more of a question for all of us, and it kind of goes back to what you said, some things you said about the Evergreen Cooperative, and you mentioned the neighborhood surrounding the cooperative and that it was a terrible neighborhood. And I personally believe that there is no such thing as a terrible neighborhood. And as we're going into this conference on economic democracy and community development, my question is for all of us is how can we, we're kind of, there's a lot of bigwigs in the co-op movement here. How can we go back to those very basic ideas of cooperation that are bringing us to like love, justice, inspiration, and like the utter belief that everyone has like the power of self-definition and sovereignty. So as we go forward, it would be great to have those kinds of questions in our mind. But I certainly thank everyone for all your knowledge.
I thank you. And she's right. She's right to correct me. It's a neighborhood that has been devastated, but it's not a terrible neighborhood. There's enormous power there. Some of you have seen Medrick Addison, one of the worker owners, on television as well, who always ends up who is a powerful, wonderful worker owner in the laundry and now represents it. And many of the people are people who have records, who have been in prison, and they are unbelievable people who have the capacity to building in this structure and saying, this is a new direction. And Medrick often ends up saying, who would believe someone like me, and this is his language, an ex-con could be taken over and managing a big business like this, and we're going to build more and more, as he points out. Not terrible people, terrible conditions is right. So thank you very much.
Hello, welcome to the Food Co-ops panel. Just to give everybody an idea of how this is going to go, we have three presenters, panelists here today, one of whom will be doing presentations on two different co-ops, so essentially 4 presentations. All of our panelists has been